Good morning. I'm Kathy Newcomer, faculty member in the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration at the George Washington University. And I'm delighted to be here this morning for one of the breakfasts that we co-host. And actually we do this on campus in normal times with the REI systems. And it's a pleasure, especially to be here to hear one of my good friends, Shelley, talk about grants management, because it's one of my favorite topics too. We at the George Washington University are a graduate school with 3 masters and a PhD in public policy and public administration as well. And we have been sending people into public service since at least 1963. We started an MPA then. And we have a lot of alumni, and I imagine some of you that are listening today, alumni of one of our public administration or public policy degrees. Grants management is an extremely important topic for public servants, and that's why we are delighted to join in. And Jeff Myers, who will introduce Shelley, is my partner in this. So Jeff, take it away.
Thanks very much, Kathy. And I really do miss being at George Washington, partly to actually eat breakfast and partly also to kind of have a chance to meet folks. I think that's one of the highlights of these events, is to build network. The caveat here is that I'm taking advantage of telework, and the silver lining is that my wife took an assignment overseas in the Foreign Service, so I'm actually doing this from Uganda, believe it or not. There may be a risk that my voice will fade in and out. I hope not. But I wanted to first give you a little bit of background about REI and these events, and then also introduce Dr. Metzenbaum. So these events' primary purpose is to help people who are interested in grants management solve problems, and to give them contacts both with presenters who can bring great ideas and experience, as well as with other members of the grants community that they can refer to and say, you know, I'm facing this sort of challenge. As anybody else, I encourage you to reach out to other folks. And to do so as well, you can reach out directly to Dr. Metzenbaum after the presentation if you like, via her website. Just as a brief bit of background, REI actually for 30 years now. Our original role was actually seeking a small business innovation and research grant from NASA, and then we turned around a year and a half later and helped NASA strengthen and automate its grants management practices with respect to that same program, and we're still NASA is still an REI customer 30 years later. Just this past year, we're pleased that we've begun work with the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Science Foundation on their grant programs. And what I think I'm most proud of is the fact that we've taken the agile approach to software development, kind of coming up with breaking a large problem down into small pieces, making really specific progress incrementally every 2 or 3 weeks. And we've helped a particular client, in this case, the Administration for Children and Families and their Office on Trafficking in Persons. They've applied that agile approach to managing their program. And by doing so, they've gotten past a number of hurdles in collaborating with other agencies, in particular, Department of Justice, that prosecute victimizers of sexual and human trafficking. They also collaborate with the Department of Homeland Security on asylee questions, and with several different components of HHS to be able to provide food and shelter and job opportunities and training for these victims. And the agile techniques used in the program management sense have helped those agencies collaborate with each other and kind of see a little bit of progress each time and back from each other on where they may have conflicts, where they may struggle with differences of opinion or differences in regulation or differences in funding authorities and restrictions. So that's something that we're particularly proud, because actually in the last, there have been 3 different awards for innovation that have been won by that program, one from ACT-IAC, one from Fed Health IT, and another from GuyTech. But let me turn now and introduce a colleague that I've known for more than 20 years and really enjoyed learning from her. Dr. Shelley Metzenbaum has served in senior roles, just to name a few, in the government of the state of Massachusetts, in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She was the Chief Performance Officer for the United States Office of Management and Budget. And so she's, and most recently has been the founding president of the Volcker Alliance. So I'm really thrilled that Shelley is turning her terrific energy and terrific knowledge and insight toward the field of grants, which is an important field, but in my opinion, kind of is a little bit underserved in terms of getting focus on grant making and carrying out federal agency missions indirectly through subsidiary grantees. So I'm excited about what Shelley's going to share with us about her recent research. And let me turn it over to Shelley. But before I do that, please feel free to type your questions into the question chat box at any point. Shelley's going to make her presentation, and then we'll pose those questions. I'll kind of help filter on. If 3 of the same question come up, I'll just ask it once of Shelley, and she'll answer your questions for the last half hour of the hour that we have together. So Shelley, would you like to take it away? And thank you so much for joining us.
Jeff, thank you. And Kathy, thank you so much for the invitation. I too have learned so much from both of you. And so it's very exciting. Plus, I'm very excited that you have created this network. And so I'm pleased to talk with all of you today. Sometimes I've been on the listening side. Today, I get to share what I've learned over the last year or more, actually more than that, about opportunities for improving federal grants management and focusing on both improving the outcomes as well as the operational quality and the transparency. Next slide, please. So why focus on federal grants? Well, I don't need to tell everybody, all of you on the phone, that grants are an important part of the federal business. You're in the business and you know how important they are. They were even before COVID. The federal government spent $765 billion annually for like the 5 years before COVID. That's gone up dramatically in the past year, and it's 30% more than the federal government spends on contracts. That's actually where it's been 30% more for the past 5 years. There are about 1,700 grant programs, and as Jeff said, historically they've gotten relatively little attention. I was actually involved in the rewriting of the GIPRA, the Government Performance and Results Act, to the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act. That's a mouthful. And what I didn't realize until I started actually working on this report was that while the Modernization Act mandates cross-agency priority goals in 5 areas of management areas, it doesn't mention grants, which is really interesting. Plus, there are like 3 federal acquisition universities, but none for grants. So there are other kinds of things that go on, but like the training grants.gov has a grants 101, AGA does a lot of training. We have, both REI's grants management breakfast, NAPA has a quarterly grants management symposium, but really there's no dedicated university to help all the people working in the many different parts of grants management. And the truth is, most of that networking and a lot of that work, and that's not completely true and it's changing, but more attention historically has been given to grant spending, to grant closeouts, which is what GIO always gets requests from Congress to look at, non-compliance issues, and other problems than attention given to outcomes, to the trends and accomplishments grants have made, how grants have actually helped the world, as well as to how grants can improve. Happily, though, that is starting to change. There are multiple laws that have passed over the last decade that focus on improving outcomes and improving grants management. That includes the GIPRA Modernization Act, the Foundations of Evidence Act, the Data Act, the GREAT Act, the Taxpayer Right to Know Act, and there are more. Beyond that, the federal government adopted a cross-agency priority goal during the Trump administration. The Biden administration hasn't yet decided what its cross-agency priority goals will be, but a lot of progress has been made in terms of bringing more attention to grant programs. And some of the examples I will show you in this talk today, actually I learned about at the Innovation Exchange sessions that OMB has been running on grants associated with the grants cap goal. So that's real progress. And beyond that, the cap goal itself talks about the need for rebalancing the federal grants management system so it's not so focused on administrative matters and puts more emphasis on improving outcomes. The grants playbook, or it's called the Federal Assistance Playbook officially, but the grants playbook re-emphasizes and increases the emphasis on that rebalancing. Next slide, please. So what I've written, and they're all available for you to read. On the title page, you will see the URL where you can find all of this, is a report on grant outcomes and what grant programs and cross-agency action and central office action can do to improve the outcomes of grant programs. And that's the most important thing, because if you're not focusing first and foremost on improving grant outcomes, then you're just putting money on the table. You're just giving money to a different entity. So you need to focus on improving grant outcomes. But also we care about improving operational quality. What do I mean by operational quality? First, I mean service quality, service, and second, I mean stewardship. And by service, it's partly process quality, but also and especially knowledge finding, building, and sharing with the field, with the grant recipients. I argue, I hope you agree, that grant programs ought to make grant recipients their service priority. And that means getting them the knowledge that they need, helping them find it and build it, and sharing that effectively. It's also, operational quality is also about stewardship, about cost effectiveness, about risk management, about fair management. And I argue it's about improving transparency. And by that, and I go into some discussion because transparency is always talked about, but what does it really mean? I mean, communicate successfully, fairly, and efficiently to improve outcomes in operational quality. So helping the grant recipients and other goal allies figure out how to improve, strengthen accountability, 3 different kinds that I'll discuss a little bit later: mutual, democratic, and performance accountability, and build understanding of and trust in government. Next slide, please. So I'm going to run through a lot of material today. And so I'll talk, as Jeff said, he was a debater, I wasn't. I'll talk fast, right? So because there's a lot that these reports and that the report and 2 white papers cover, and then leave some room for questions, but you can also follow up with me. But I do want to give you an overview of what the content of the reports are, so that you can know what to look for and what might be in there. But beyond that, so you can start to be part of thinking about this and bringing about and sharing your own ideas about how to improve the grant management process. So I offer in the report a vision for change, both long-term, but identifying actions that can start now. And I share examples of what's worked well in the past, but also examples of what's not worked well. And then I want to enlist you in the change efforts. You guys who are participating, listening in on this webinar, you are the change makers in your own world or working across with each other. And that's the beauty of a network like this. Now, you may not agree with all the recommendations I make. If you don't, I'd urge you to think very hard and then share your thoughts about areas of disagreement and what you think ought to be done instead. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the report it identifies issues needing attention. It finds and shares examples that are worth continuing and copying. It encourages a search for better practices, but also identifies past problems to avoid. I won't go into that all today, but there's a lot of discussion, especially on incentive structures and things like that in the report and white papers. And then I make recommendations for future improvements. To whom? To grant programs themselves. One of the big recommendations is we need outcome brokers in every grant program. I'll explain that a little bit in a second. Cross-program action and also central office action to support learning and collaboration across grant programs by OMB, but the others, GSA, Census, Treasury, HHS, who's now the Quizmo, I don't know how to say that, but many others who play an incredibly important role in the grant information process and facilitating the learning across grant programs, but also GAO and other oversight bodies. What they look at, the questions they ask, the issues they try and address can make a big difference, but also how they organize their information, in addition to how the executive branch organizes its information. Next slide. So, in addition, in the report, I found a number of different areas of opportunity for improvement. One is, and that's great, I mean, there's really a lot of changes. They don't all have to happen at once, and they don't all have to come from the central office by dictate down. Individual grant programs can make changes. They can change the questions they ask. Grantees, they can help grantees can change the questions they ask. Policymakers can change the questions they ask. From questions like what works, so we can find what works and fund it what works and defund what doesn't, to instead using evidence to figure out where to focus, to inform where to focus, and then to find ways to improve. So you want grant programs can help their grant recipients find what works better, and the situational differences that affect effectiveness. There's other huge areas of opportunity with data analytics and well-designed trials. We're getting more sophisticated about rapid cycle testing, but frankly, you can do a whole lot more well-designed trials integrated into operations if you structure your data well. There's lots of opportunity for thinking about what the roles and responsibilities are for people who work in government, but also the skill sets that need to be developed. I heard someone making a presentation on COVID the other day who talked about we have a lot of generalists and specialists in government, but we may need some synthesists, people who play a role of synthesizing. That is in some ways what I mean by outcome broker. There's huge opportunities with communication that we can do this webinar without being in the same room. We miss some opportunities of the socializing and the interesting and important conversations that happen when you are in the room together. But we also are able to reach out to more people, at the same time, who might not have been able to come into the room. They weren't in the same city. They couldn't, the costs weren't there. So there's huge advantages in communication, the internet itself, et cetera. And beyond that, there's huge advances in the way we think about community and how technology has helped us build both synchronous and asynchronous learning systems, collaboration systems, et cetera. What's also important is the processes and routines we use to make sure they connect us, people, with each other and to the relevant evidence, so you can understand it and apply it to decide next steps, and then come back and say, did that work as we hoped? If not, let's adjust. The agility, the agile approach that Jeff is talking about. And finally, there's huge areas of opportunity for improvement, and also in some cases problems in accountability expectations and incentive structures. So how do we, there are ways to improve that. I hope to help you think about that so you run into fewer problems with, for example, people gaming picking timid targets instead of the kind of targets that stimulate innovation and discovery, leading to better performance and better results. Also, people who manipulate the measurement system, because we have seen that in federal grant funded programs because the stakes were so high and nobody paid attention to the evidence about incentive systems. Next slide, please. So let me start by talking, since I said we need to manage grants to improve outcomes first and foremost. That's what I want to talk about first. The truth is that's easy to say, but it can be very hard to do. One of the problems is, to some extent, that there's a lack of clarity in some grant programs about outcome objectives and responsibility for outcome improvements. On that first thing, the lack of clarity about outcome objectives, the fact is, if I look at sam.gov, it was beta.sam.gov, it's now become sam.gov. I haven't looked at it in its new version yet, but sam.gov actually has a place for every grant program to talk about its objectives. It can also has a place for every grant program to talk about its accomplishments. An awful lot of those things are not very filled out in anything more than a perfunctory way, whereas there could be an opportunity to communicate to not only grant recipients and grant applicants, but also to others who might be able to, who care about the outcomes and be able to contribute. And there's also a lack of clarity about who's responsible for outcome improvement. There is, unlike the list that OFFM keeps on those who work on the administrative and fiscal matters, there's no comparable list for those who work on the outcome matters. And therefore, it's pretty hard to find and communicate with them. And yet it wouldn't be that hard to start building that list and build it better over time. Also, there can be difficulty finding as well as difficulty sharing relevant data. People are working on that hard right now, but there's so much potential here. And then finally, there is an emphasis imbalance. The oversight infrastructure really overwhelms the insight generating infrastructure. There's a survey done by the Federal Demonstration Project, which is the R&D folks. They've done 3 surveys that found more than 40% of time of the grant recipient is spent on administrative matters rather than improving the outcomes, doing the discoveries or the other kind of basic and applied research that they got funded to do. And when I did interviews of folks in other programs like the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, they spoke about similar problems where they said, we don't have time to keep out of trouble. We don't have time anymore to figure out where we should be focusing. Fortunately, the really great news is that data and analytic advances create unprecedented opportunities for outcome improvement. But next slide, please. It's not just about the data and the analytics. We also need attention to the people, the outcome brokers who, if a grant program has 1, 2, 5, 7 outcome objectives, who is actually managing progress on those objectives, reaching out to the evaluation of policy shops, reaching out to the IT folks, reaching out to other experts, to researchers, et cetera, who is managing that, collaborating, and that outcome broker does not need to be in the grant program. But man, if nobody is trying to bring folks together who are working on the same outcomes, then they're all just kind of doing all their own thing, as opposed to looking at what they know, what needs to be known, and with the learning agendas, we ought to be collaborating on building those learning agendas, not just program by program, but focused on outcomes and assembling the outcome teams. And we need to pay attention to the incentives within government to pay attention to outcome improvement. And frankly, the incentives that grant programs give grant recipients, and then also the incentives to work across programs, because so many of the outcomes grant programs try to influence have interdependencies. We need attention to communication and community. If continuous learning and improvement communities exist, how do you support and nurture them? Where they don't exist, how do you encourage their creation and then support and nurture them? And communication, I'll go into that in a few minutes, about the different objectives of communication. And then again, how data and evidence are used. There's an awful lot of experience that shows that unless you are able to have third-party monitors and you can, that there's not measurement manipulation, and you can, you have good motivating, and a big enough threat of a penalty or even an award, when you use link penalties or rewards to evidence, what tends to happen is, in all but very few exceptions, the Clean Air Act is one of them, but even that had to have some agility and adjust the modeling it used for deciding who got penalized. It's much better not to reward or punish attainment of a goal, but actually the use of the practices that I'm talking about today. Next slide, please. So it's not necessarily surprising that there are so few people paying attention to outcomes improvement. If you look at this grant life cycle chart that GAO has done, if you read down it, you go, wait a minute, where is the evidence use that everybody's talking about all the time? Where does it fit in the grant life cycle? I actually don't see it. Maybe it helps you figure out what the opportunity, the pre-award stage, announce the opportunity, but that's provide administrative and technical support. But what about actually figuring out where you're going to focus and what criteria you're going to use to choose grantees if it's, not a, if it's a competitive grant? And then if you look at management and oversight, it's about conducting site visits and review frequent review reports. I can't read that. Recipient reports. But who's analyzing the data? Where in the grant life cycle does the analysis of the data look? Where do well-designed trials happen? And then the closeout, where's the after action? Where's the retrospective that says, okay, how could we do it better next time? Next slide. The OMB grant life cycle chart. Next slide, please. The OMB grant life cycle chart has some of the same problems. You've got a pre-award phase, an award phase, a post-award phase, but the language in the implementation section says support, and the verbs tell a very different story. Review, reports, site visits, audits. Next slide, please. So what's great is the grant playbook actually points you to the State Department report that has some of the language that we might want to integrate back into the grant lifecycle report. Next slide, please. So I want you to consider, please, whether you work on increasing the beneficial impact of your program. If you don't, do you know who does? If you do you talk with a person who does to figure out how your work can help them? And think, is it important to know what each grant program's outcome objectives are? And is it important to know who's leading efforts to make progress on those objectives, the outcome brokers? I would argue the answer to 2 and 3 is yes. Next slide, please. So let me start by talking about what it takes to improve outcomes. I would say it takes finding, building, sharing, and using evidence. Now, what do I mean by evidence? I mean data analyses, not just evaluations. And I mean evidence, data, and analysis to inform where to focus, both for action and knowledge building, as well as evaluations, running well-designed trials, not to fund what works, but to find what works better, and the situational differences affecting effectiveness, as well as the lessons from failed trials that can be applied so that you figure out where you go next to continue to improve. So for what purpose? As I said, to inform where to focus, which means doing some positive outlier analysis in a number of programs to find those outperforming their peers from which to learn or whom to hire. And other kinds of useful analyses like correlation for prediction, causal factors that can be influenced, clusters that might be a locus of problems or an opportunity for scale economies, sudden or unexpected changes, and anomalous statistics. Next slide. There's lots of things that can be done. So I'm going to run through a few examples of evidence. Here's a great example of evidence being used to inform focus. What you're looking at here is a map of Massachusetts wetlands. And the one on the left, you see in both of them the blue outlines. In the late 1980s, the capital budget in Massachusetts was used to fund a plane that flew over all of Massachusetts and took high quality photos that could be blown up enough that experts could look at those photos and figure out where the wetlands were, whether there were red maples or whatever. Now I have to tell you, I was running the capital budget office at the time, and my reaction to this was, why are you protecting wetlands? Why don't you want wetlands laws? Because isn't that just a mosquito breeding area? But I learned, and fortunately there was, an entrepreneurial person in the agency, in the environmental agency, who said, we need to do this. And they convinced the capital budget office to fund the flyover and pay for, with capital funding, the people who would look at the photos and map the wetlands. And it turned out to be a remarkably good investment. If you look at the right photo, what you see, what's happened in the world since then, is that there's satellite photography. You don't need a plane. There's digitization of photographs, and there's higher quality photographs. And so you can digitize old photographs. So now the computer spits out where there's been more than a 10% change in the area within a mapped wetlands, that it's just changed, which then the enforcement agency can look at, and you see where the building construction was done in the wetland, and they can look at that and decide whether or not to take an enforcement action, which in this case they did, and lo and behold, they won the case easily. But even more important, the head of that office said, 90% of my staff was working on permits and inspecting permit holders, and it turns out that 90% of wetlands loss was in areas that weren't even bothering to come in to get permits. So informs where to focus, and it also helps you figure out if what you're doing improves or not. Next slide, please. Technology helps on this a lot, but as I said, the first set of things, the first set of photos were done in airplanes, but technology's made this much more cheap, much less expensive, easier to use. You can get more frequent photos, but technology is not essential. In 1854, John Snow did a cholera map, where he mapped where people with cholera was, what homes, and where the water pumps in the town where in London were. And lo and behold, they all clustered around a single pump, and so they took the handle off the pump. It's not about technology, it's about attitude. It is about a relentless focus on outcome improvement, which is, and then figuring out, how do I find the information I need? Next slide. We have lots of programs that do monitoring. Almost an awful lot of grant programs go out and communicate and analyze monitoring data, collect monitoring data. but how do they organize it and analyze it so they can learn from it? And then how do they communicate it so others can learn from it? So this is, you can tell I worked in Massachusetts in the environmental area as well as the capital budget. This is an environmental results program. This is actually self-reporting by one of the regulated sectors. And note how there you can see immediately which areas have low compliance. And beyond that, if you had a list of what those areas were, you could say, is this a big risk or not? Do we care that compliance is low or not? And then if you do this for multiple years, this is 97 and 98, you can see if you know 36I, you know, they did something that went up. But if you look at 37, hey, look, it's trending down. So this triggers questions. Now, maybe they didn't do anything. And the workbook that the self-reporters use gives them suggestions about what to do. So it looks like somebody did something that worked, whether it was the workbook or a training program or whatever. Why don't we organize more of our monitoring data from grants this way to help both grant recipients and the grant program? Next slide, please. I mentioned also looking for positive outliers. The Education Department has funded, on the right, you see stuff from Education Trust. Years ago, it funded Education Trust to create what was called the Dispelling the Myth database, which identified and listed high poverty, high minority, and high performing schools. So you could find schools that had 2 or 3 of the above. And they did that for multiple years. Education Trust then used that to identify the positive outliers, the extraordinary districts, they call them. And then it went in, a journalist went in and she did studies of those extraordinary districts. If you go into Education Trust website, you can click on these and it will tell you, and I clicked on one and it turns out that that extraordinary district and its programs were shut down. That extraordinary school, I'm sorry, was shut down. I wonder who's looking at what they're finding about these extraordinary districts and helping the ones that are extraordinary not only continue, but also help other schools become extraordinary. And why did it get shut down? What can we learn about that? On the left side, you see the Stanford Education Opportunity Project has, again, funded by the Education Department, has done a scatter diagram that makes really clear that Chicago public schools outperform all other major schools and many other minor schools. The vertical axis is performance, the horizontal axis is wealth. It's performing most other school systems on growth in 3rd to 8th grade. My question is, how's this information being used? I've read something from someone, the head of IES, the Institute for Education Sciences, that suggests there was a replication effort, but I can't find anything about that replication effort. How are we using this kind of analysis of positive outliers? Are we doing it? Are we structuring our data so we can do positive outlier analysis where it's relevant? Maybe not in some programs, but in other programs. How are we using and following up on what we find to say, is there any replicable practice they have? Let's go test it in another place. Next slide, please. Now, the truth is that this kind of analysis can be applied not just to improving outcomes, but improving operational quality. The Federal Emergency Management Administration took all of its audit and IG data, et cetera, and put it into a single database. I learned about this, and you can get the full slide deck either on NAPA Grants Management Symposium or on the Innovation Exchange sessions of OMB. But notice how what they decided to do was code all of their non-compliant findings by the non-compliant section of the law. And that bubble chart tells you which ones are most non-compliant. And again, you can say, is that a problem or is that not a problem? The map shows you where are they most non-compliant. Is that a problem or not a problem? And then you have a trend chart that suggests that this kind of analysis, which is being shared with the managers, not yet with the public, though they hope to, this kind of analysis can help you bring down your operational, improve your operational quality and bring down operational problems. Next slide, please. So this kind of work hopefully gets done by grant programs. As I said, I think this is the kind of work that grant programs ought to be doing, supporting the field to learn from experience. Oftentimes, grant programs have worked with grant recipients from the get-go to figure out what measurement should we do. This is the Adult Developmental Disabilities Program. The National Core Indicators Project was started by the grant recipients, but the federal program's been incredibly supportive, and they bring together information and continually improve the measurement systems they're using, but also share ways to analyze the measurement, to communicate the measurement to local folks like state legislatures, local officials, so they can get more support for their program and to increase the use of better practices. Next slide, please. Similarly, the guy who was at University of Chicago consortium, which helped works closely with Chicago Public Schools and probably explains their better performance, is now at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and they set up for community colleges and for colleges, how do we help students who are coming into college do better in math programs? And what you see here is the remarkable success rate. They've tripled the success rate in half the time for the students coming into these programs, and among the students enrolled in Pathways programs, and they are comparing to controls. Next slide, please. There's another grant recipient network. The National Head Start Association has the Data Design Initiative that's created its own analytics playbook that is getting examples from grant programs of analyses they've done. So just to share with other grant programs, not grant programs, grant recipients, other Head Start programs. So they're sharing in the analytics playbook at data.nhsa.org. They're sharing these, and each analytics play has a how-to. How do I do this? Next slide, please. But then think about how do we communicate this data? So one of the challenges is to communicate successfully, fairly, and efficiently. And I would argue it's for three purposes. First, to improve outcomes and operational quality. And for that, you got to return the data to data suppliers and make sure when you're communicating it's successful. I've given you some examples just now about some of those kinds of successful practices. Also, you need to communicate to strengthen accountability, mutual accountability between the grant program and the grant recipient, democratic accountability. Have we got the right goals? Are we using the right measures? Do people agree with the strategies? If not, let's get some debate and discussion and decision making. And then performance accountability, not for making targets, but for managing this way. And finally, we need to improve transparency to build understanding of and trust in government. Next slide, please. So consider these examples. This is from a lead poisoning program. This was from a NOFO for tribal lead grants, I believe. And the NOFO linked to an action plan, which included this wonderful slide that gives me a sense of how lead poisoning has gone down over time and the actions government has taken to influence and bring about the reduction in lead poisoning. And then I'm sure, though I didn't read it, that the grant program, the NOFO itself explained where the organization was focusing now, where this actually collaborative effort to reduce lead poisoning was focusing now. Obviously, tribal lands is an area where lead poisoning is too high. Why not have every grant program include that kind of information in the NOFO? So I can look historically and I can link to the evidence repositories as well as the learning agendas. Next slide, please. And then also, let's see, are you on the, okay, I'm kind of lost, yes. Back up, please. Okay, stay there, that's good. So next slide, please, thank you. This is from EPA's annual performance report, and it tells you what the trends are as well as what the next steps were planned. That to me is very helpful, and my guess is many of you have this kind of information. My hope is many of you have this kind of information that could be linked into both SAM.gov and the NOFOs, etc. Next slide, please. And I should mention this slide actually also identifies the challenges. This is from the Federal Aviation Administration. And I mention it because they try to put dollars in the picture, although they only put the supply dollars in the picture, not the demand dollars. So how many airplanes, how many passengers, how many airports. And then they also give you their trends over time. Now, personally, I would prefer to have a graph, a chart kind of the way EPA had done, or if it is for R&D or discrete accomplishments, a lot of what NASA does, just give me the descriptions of the discrete accomplishments. But what I don't like about this chart, I said I'd tell you some things I don't like. I wish they would put in a trend line, but also they talk about targets met or not. Now, if you look at these targets, you'll realize they're actually easier than the prior year actuals, and yet they met the target. So, I mean, it's too easy to pick timid targets, to game the system. Plus, you had a major accident. And so I would kind of like a footnote that explains it a little bit more to me and gives me a sense of whether the moving average is going in the right direction or not, and what the organization plans to do about it. Next slide, please. So I just share this with you because we talk about, I showed you graphs, I showed you narrative, but you know, we can also use photos to give a sense of the accomplishments of grant programs. And we can map to sort of say, where are we making progress? Where don't we? And with today's technology, you could drill down on that map and find those pictures and find the information, and also maybe provoke action more quickly. How do we actually use our communication skills? So how did Flint, Michigan drinking water happen? And how is it that West Virginia has like 86 or whatever it is, now 70 of every 100 persons has an opioid prescription? Really? Come on. And it was higher than that. And yet, why didn't it trigger action? Next slide, please. Also, the way you tell that grant story. So I showed you how the lead poisoning, this is the grant impact story tool that REI actually did. It's also something I learned about on the Innovation Exchange. The URL is in the slide. Next slide, please. And this I just mentioned, this is the Consumer Confidence Report. I don't know how many of you know that you've gotten this Consumer Confidence Report, but every one of us who lives in a community with public water supply gets it. But really, who pays attention? How does Flint happen? How can we improve the communication so that it actually advances our objectives? And let's be clear about what those objectives are and how to do it without scaring the bejesus out of people. Next slide, please. And then how do we communicate evidence? You know, so many of the evidence things help me understand, did this program, this trial work on average? But in fact, what we want to know is the distribution. Those folks on the left-hand side in that square box on the right for this reading recovery program, they did not get better results. Do they have distinguishable features? Moreover, do the positive deviants have distinguishable features? We've seen with a drug called Keytruda, and I talk about it in the report, where a trial had, well, 30 people had 29 of them not do well, but one person did, and the doctor followed up to see if they had distinguishable characteristics. They did. They screened for them, and they did a trial on those people, and that drug now serves 60,000 people a year. Next slide, please. So just and then evidence repositories. So this is the reading stuff that What Works Clearinghouse and Education Department tells you about that reading recovery program. How does it compare to other programs? What do I know? I don't know about you, but I can't use it. Education Department deserves a lot of credit for being out front in building the first What Works Clearinghouse of this sort. There have been other departments that have made more progress since then. We need to build a community of evidence repository and probably learning agenda folks who get user-centered design principles to improve the way we share evidence. Next slide, please. So just to recap, what do we want to communicate? Goals, measurement, other data and analysis, and trial findings to? I would argue to nominate, where to focus, et cetera. Illuminate what's working, what's better, what's not working, to motivate, to allocate resources, to stimulate innovation, to enlist and engage others, to inform the choice of goals and better practices, products, and providers, and then to build understanding and trust in government. Next slide. There are lots of opportunities, and I make specific recommendations about what grant programs can do, what can be done across grant programs. And then I also think the grants playbook and guidance, both the grants guidance and other guidance like the performance guidance, can evolve so it's easier to use and it's not just a small group of people reading it to make sure they're in compliance. Let's use the new technology to figure out how to make this information more useful. Let's use new technology to facilitate coordination on shared outcomes and for shared beneficiaries. And then we already have folks starting to share platforms. Let's build more platforms that more grant programs can use. NASA uses PubMed to share evidence. Clinicaltrials.gov allows you to say, what is my planned research? And I know that's needed in social science research. And also, we're just starting to do learning agendas. Let's make them dynamic so we can engage others. But let's not make all the agencies build their own solutions. Let's create networks among them to help build shared solutions when they want to, or just learn from each other's. Next slide, please. That will require some changes in how data are collected and what data are collected and how they're shared and used. I make recommendations for data standards, both for SAM.gov, USAspending.gov, and performance.gov. We need outcome category data standards. We need goal type and grant mechanism categories. We need operational risk categories. And then in outcome programs like evidence repositories, like performance.gov, we need to have the individual grant program identifiers added to every strategic goal and objective so you can see which program goals are contributing. The program inventory is started, may go in this direction. Let's not do these all as separate things. Let's figure out how to use data standards and practices to manage learning across programs and manage across programs, collaborate. Plus, we need to learn more about how to structure data so you can get the granularity, the temporal and the geographic frequency, the timeliness, not timelines, to make the data more useful for everyone to inform where they focus and find ways to improve. To think about the granularity, the units of analysis, we probably ought to have some learning communities within the federal government helping each other for the different kinds of grant goals, conditions, incidents, standards, et cetera. We need more data and analytic capacity, and we need more capacity to learn how to communicate better. Next slide, please. So in addition to the data, we also need to make decisions about people, about effective communication, and the accountability expectation and incentive structures. We need to evolve those, and I make recommendations about that. Next slide, please. So basically, I'm now ready for questions or expressions of concerns or suggestions. And if you're ready to lead progress or contribute to progress on next steps, please step forward. You don't need to contact me for that. That's just to tell you how to contact me. But I hope you'll all work with each other to bring about needed change. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you. And I look forward to the beginning of many wonderful, not only conversations, but action to bring about better outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelley. We've had a couple of questions already submitted. For those of you who have not but would like to, you can type them into the question box or you can click to raise your hand. Let me start out with a question from Blue Cole, who said, and actually, if you're able to move us to slide 17 or 16 of the presentation, Blue said, the photo analysis method or idea for wetlands in 1996 was a great idea. How could that be shared with 49 other states? And what that made me think in particular is that if you look at not this slide, but slide 17, the next one I think it is, what I've seen a lot is folks, I'm sorry, 18, the one with Chicago Public
Schools, yeah.
Folks say, I'm sharing what I think is a wonderful idea, and that idea, they don't have a lot of evidence about it. So if you look at the graph on the lower right, maybe Anne Arundel County and is saying what wonderful things they're doing. So the first question I have, Shelley, is how can people learn systematically what other folks are doing? And second, how do we make sure that the good example, the evidence behind it of Chicago, is the one that gets shared most, and the one that maybe isn't quite as strong, like one of the unnamed ones that's got less than 2 years progress, either doesn't get shared or gets shared as a kind of a lesson on what to avoid?
So Jeff, I love the question. And I think and it's the reason I actually pulled all these examples into the slide presentation, because I would actually like to see grant programs stepping forward, but also cross-agency action stepping forward to build the capacity to do this, to focus on finding the positive outliers. And then Chicago Public Schools, is there something in this, secret sauce in the University of Chicago consortium, folks? I don't think so. And in fact, the fact that Carnegie Foundation did it for colleges suggests that it is replicable. But then who in the grant program or outside the grant program is working on the outcome objectives to analyze it. That's why I'm calling for an outcome broker to ask this question. Who's figuring out what data we need to share and how to share it about positive outliers, about drill downs to try and understand what they're doing, like Education Trust has done, and then who's funding replication demonstrations and the results of those replication demonstrations and deciding what to do next. And I think that's where the community and the routines, and if you look at the GIPRA Modernization Act, it requires on priority goals at no less than quarterly reviews to look at the data, bring everybody around the table and say, okay, what are we going to do next? Okay, who's going to do it? I think this is where the huge opportunity is, and technology makes this so much more affordable if you try and design the data systems and assign the responsibilities to do this.
Let me ask, just as a springboard, your other example of wetlands. Those of us who worked with the federal government for a while realize Environmental Protection Agency has a role, Army Corps of Engineers has a role, Bureau of Reclamation has a role, USDA with farm runoff has a role. And so the first question a little bit is maybe, how do we find all of the folks who have roles? And the second is, there may be some commonality in terms of the measured data that could be gathered. So we don't ask if there are 5 different agencies. We don't ask the poor grant recipient to gather 5 different types of data. Maybe instead we ask them to gather one type of data, and then we kind of share that across those 5 or however many agencies there are. Is there a way that you can imagine to solve that sort of a challenge that, gathering performance measures is tough and it's burdensome on grantees? And if they gather a bit less because it's coordinated across grantors, maybe they'll do it better.
So one of the places I suggest getting started is identifying outcome objectives and having a data standards for different outcome objectives. So let's take water, okay? Because it turns out EPA doesn't regulate wetlands per se. Massachusetts has a stronger thing, but let's take water. It's drinking water, it's surface water, it's wetlands. My guess is it's, standing water, salt water, all those different kinds of things. So getting people across the federal government to set data standards for those different outcome categories, and so that I can actually see, okay, this is the big category. Now I can see the programs that are contributing to that category and their outcome objectives, and putting that information, whether it is into, I hadn't thought about rules, but it's a really good point, or the evidence repository, or the strategic goals and objectives in the agency and component goals and plans, and putting that together on performance.gov and in USA spending. It's not really that hard anymore. It does take people sitting down, but again, the QSMO and the GREAT Act require data standards here for grants. So let's make sure the outcomes aren't left behind and it's not just about payment ease.
Yeah. So we have a question from Matthew Muir that I think is going to resonate widely. He says, I love the focus on outcomes. The big question is, we've got so many administrative compliance rules. Which ones of those can we get rid of so we can spend more time on outcomes? Is there any way to figure that out?
Yeah, so that's why I added the FEMA graphic, and I love the FEMA graphic because I think that there's 2 things about that graphic. One is they're actually analyzing the risks. I once said the risk. They're analyzing the non-compliance. Now, I've actually said in the report that what I think needs to happen is you now also need to, and you can also, one of the things you could do is after action reviews. Let's create platforms that make it easier for agencies to do this. And I believe the Federal Audit Clearinghouse data is going to be modernized so that it gets electronically produced instead of being submitted as it now is as an image, as a PDF document, so that FEMA has had to go through into it individually and hand write it all down. And they may have done some Word things, but let's share all of that. But beyond that, in addition to non-compliance, let's actually start to pay attention more to the real world risks and whether our compliance obligations are lining up with them. Beyond that, I think it's time to start talking with the oversight entities and say, hey, you're stealing all of my time on these administrative matters, and it's not clear to me. I mean, if it's reducing risk, that's good. And so we don't want, what I showed you on what I talked about on opioids. I mean, that's a bigger risk, but I bet you it's not showing up as a risk. How is that
Yeah.
possible? So let's start talking more to the oversight entities, but are also the grant program's own monitoring operations to say, what are we trying to learn from it? How do we manage it? And I suspect that if we start to be more systematic about the stuff that's overwhelming us, we will start to be able to reduce it. I once had a client who was saying, I'm constantly being called by the county council. That's what I said, what's your biggest time? He said, so we're so busy. I said, well, just track your time. And it was all calls from county councilors, right? So he looked at them and he started to organize what they were asking about, and then went in and had meetings with them to figure out what their priorities were so that he could give them the information they needed. And the call volume went way down and everybody did better. So, I think that's why people are so important part of the picture who are actually thinking about these questions.
One thing I might mention, REI is working on a number of things behind the scenes, and we're trying to kind of know of whom actually there is at least one or a couple of representatives on this call to kind of think about this, and instead of eat the whole elephant, just kind of choose one or two or three program areas. It could be one is water quality, or it could be another is education, or another is housing, but then essentially to kind of try and assemble the various grantors and take that kind of user-centric model that Shelley's describing, which is to say, find a number of grantees and say, all right, you grantees, you can listen to you, what's the administrative challenge, and how can we kind of help resolve that across different federal grantors working in the same arena. In the wetlands or water quality area, again, it might be EPA and Army Corps of Engineers and USDA and so forth. But I do think that needs something kind of from a central perspective to kind of coordinate the agencies at the federal level. I don't think they'll just kind of coordinate themselves automatically. We have time for one last question. Sorry, this is from Charmaine Rimple. And again, I think it has broad appeal. She says, how can a specialist or a generalist up their game to be able to know kind of a better way to synthesize material as they are seeking grants to promise that performance improvement and then to actually follow through?
So I think, first of all, you need to say to yourself, I want to do this, and then try and find the resources. I've written extensively. Kathy teaches about this, about how you manage this way, stat systems. There was a memo I did before the Bush administration that, Marcus Peacock from EPA used to try and move EPA in the right direction, which it's moved a long way since I worked at EPA. So I think, but I will also tell you that I had a woman sit in on a meeting from the EPA, sit in on a meeting with USDA on their goal, and heard that USDA in the Obama administration had a water quality goal, which she then took up to her agricultural colleagues in New England, in a state in New England, and said, hey, did you know that's a goal? So go look at the agency's performance goals and objectives in other agencies too, and then use it to start locally if you want to. I didn't talk to you about the Charles River, which has been a remarkable turnaround in terms of making the river going from being swimmable 19% of the time to now over 80% of the time. Because people used the outcome measurement to bring people together and ask questions. So I'm happy to talk to you about this afterwards if you like, but I would urge all of you to say, okay, first, what are my grant program's outcome objectives? And be very clear about that. And then second, who is actually managing progress on that, whether in your program or outside? And who else is working on it? Can I bring them together so we can start to think about how to work on this together? So I should have put you can reach betterproject.info is my website, and you can contact me through that. There's a contact note on that, but I would urge all of you to ask that question. That was a Charmel or something that you said. Yes. It is just the right question, because you can make a difference. One person, the guy who did the wetlands, made a difference in Massachusetts. And the irony is, after I ran the capital budget, I went to and became his boss in the environmental agency, not knowing anything about environmental protection. I was a human services person. But this way of working, it works for regulatory programs, it works for grant programs. In grant programs, I've tried to get you thinking. What I'd love to see is more of you starting to share these kinds of examples. Let's get a shared platform to share these examples, and then let's talk to each other about how to improve the platform so it's more useful.
Great. We've had more than 200 folks attending. I want to answer one question that was answered on the chat. We will share within 48 hours both the slides that Dr. Metzenbaum presented as well as the 2 white papers that she referenced. So you'll get a link to all of that. And let me turn it back over to Kathy Newcomer.
Thank you very much, Shelley. As you know, I am very interested in everything you had to say. We at the Trachtenberg School teach actually skills and data visualization, and in actually, I call it knowledge brokering when we talk in our evaluation classes. So yes, there are lots of classes on evaluation and data analytics in the Trachtenberg School, and I love that you mentioned the network improvement communities. And I know you cited their work, but the work is in a book, Learning to Improve by Burkett and so on, from that whole project that they did with the community colleges. I actually use in one of my classes. And it's a great book to tell you how do you build. That was the project where they wanted to improve the outcomes from community colleges, and they focus in on the math classes. Anyway, it's a great book. I'm glad that you gave them some credit. So thank you very much. It was delightful. And thank you very much for all of you. I hope you will join us about every other month, starting back when the school year starts in September. And let's, fingers crossed, we'll be back in the Marvin Center actually having some coffee together. So thank you very much all. And thank you, Shelley.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciated it. And good luck, everybody.